So part 2 of World War II test review. It starts off with, again, a matching section here where you're supposed to match some home front organizations to their actual kind of the reason why they exist, including the Office of Price Administration, War Labor Board, Fair Employment Practices Commission, and the War Production Board. But don't make this too tough. I think if you just read, you can make a pretty educated, make some pretty educated choices here. War Production Board goes with a group that is assigned priorities with respect to using raw materials in the production of war facilities. And then the Office of Price Administration, it controls inflation and the rise and fall of prices. War Labor Board imposes ceilings on wage increases, labor and wages. The Fair Employment Practice Commission has to do with making sure that employment in war industries does not result in discrimination practices against African Americans. So fair employment is making sure there's no discrimination. War Labor Board has to do with making sure wages don't increase too much. Office of Price Administration makes sure that cost doesn't go up too much because of inflation. And the War Production Board makes sure that everybody has the natural resources that they need. While most American workers were strongly committed to the war effort, wartime production was disrupted by strikes occasionally. And the United Mine Workers was kind of the leading union, the United Mine Workers. During World War II, labor unions substantially increased their membership. Employment of more than 6 million women in American industry during World War II led to the establishment of daycare centers by the government at workplaces. The main reason the majority of women war workers left the labor force at the end of World War II was because of family obligations. They had children. African Americans did all of the following work during World War II, except they did not fight in integrated combat units. They did serve in the Army, Air. They did form militant organizations. They did move north and west in large numbers. They did rally behind a double V, V for victory and V for victory at war and V for victory against racism at home. But they did not fight in integrated combat units. It was still segregated. During World War II, most Americans economically experienced a prosperity and a doubling of personal income. The northward migration of African Americans accelerated after World War II because of the mechanical cotton pickers that were being used in the fields and in agriculture in the South. During World War II, American Indians moved off of the reservations in large numbers. By the end of World War II, the heart of the United States African American community had shifted to northern cities. The national debt increased most during World War II. Most of the money raised to finance World War II came from borrowing mainly from American people through war bonds. The first naval battle in history, in which all the fighting was done by carrier-based aircraft, was the Battle of the Coral Sea. The tide of Japanese conquest in the Pacific was turning, and it followed the Battle of Midway, 1942, Midway. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers are sunk. That's where the tide was changed. The Japanese made a crucial mistake in 1942 in their attempt to control most of the Pacific when they became overextended themselves instead of digging in and consolidating their gains. In waging war against Japan, the United States relied mainly on a strategy of island hopping across the South Pacific. And the conquest eventually of Guam in 1944 was especially critical. This was where the Americans now could, for the first time, conduct round-trip bombing raids on the Japanese home islands. I know I told you Iwo Jima was incredibly important as well, but Guam was the first island in which the round-trip bombing raids were possible. Until spring of 1943, perhaps, Hitler's greatest opportunities in defeating Britain and winning the war was the German U-boat, and it would destroy, he was hoping, destroy Allied shipping. Hitler's advance in the European theater of war crested in late 1942 at the Battle of Stalingrad. So I've mentioned several times, 1942 marks the high point of all Allied victories. So the Allies start to turn the tide. So Germany's advance into Europe or into Russia is turned around at Stalingrad. Germany's advance in Africa is turned around at El Alamein, 1942. Japan's advance into the Pacific is turned around at Midway, 1942. The Allies postponed opening the Second Front in Europe in 1944 because of British reluctance and lack of adequate resources. Roosevelt's and Churchill's insistence on the absolute and unconditional surrender of Germany eventually complicated the problems of post-war reconstruction. President Roosevelt's promise to the Soviets to open the Second Front in Western Europe ultimately proved impossible to keep. A couple more chronological questions here. We have VJ Day and VE Day and D-Day. VJ Day is victory in Japan, obviously last. VE Day, victory in Europe, second to last. D-Day comes first. Invasion of Italy is even before all of those. The major consequence of the Allied conquest of Sicily means that when Mussolini of the Italians is defeated, almost immediately then the Germans pour a whole bunch of troops into Italy, and it marks a bit of a slower advance on our part. Now we have to actually fight the Germans in Italy. Major consequence of the Allied conquest of Sicily was an overthrow of Mussolini and Italy's unconditional surrender. After the Italian surrender, the German army poured into Italy and stalled the Allies' advance. The real impact of the Italian front on World War II may have been that it delayed the D-Day invasion and allowed the Soviet Union to advance further into Eastern Europe. The cross-channel invasion of Normandy to open a second front in Europe was commanded by Dwight Eisenhower. The forgotten man at the Democrat Convention of 1944 was Roosevelt himself, because everybody looked at him and knew he was going to die, so all of the focus was on who's his vice president going to be. So much attention was focused on who would gain the vice presidency. Roosevelt won the election in 1944 primarily because the war was going so well. Hitler's last-ditch effort, last-ditch attempt to achieve victory was the Battle of the Bulge. As a result of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, is that Japan was finished as a naval power. The spending of enormous sums on the original atomic bomb project was spurred by belief that the American public would not tolerate the casualties that would result ultimately from a land invasion of Japan, and this unconditional surrender policy towards Japan was finally modified a little bit by agreeing to let Japan keep Emperor Hirohito on the throne. Then you have two essays. Answer one. Hopefully you'll know these. Can you list 3, 4, maybe 5 reasons why Truman justified dropping the bomb? And obviously you could say saves time, saves money, saves American lives, ends the war quickly. Please also make sure that you focus on the idea that if we can win the war against Japan without the Soviets' help, that was very essential and crucial, because we did not want the Soviets to have any influence in post-World War II Japan. And then the other one is, can you please be able to list 3 at least 3 major turning points of World War II. Focus on 1942. Talk about Midway, turning the Japanese around and going island hopping. Can you focus on Stalingrad, the Soviets pushing the Germans back, in El Alamein? You could say D-Day. That's a huge turning point because we opened a third front in Europe. There might be some others, but those are the biggest ones that are easy to write about. So that pretty much is the review for the test. World War II test, chapter 34 and 35 out of your book.